Hey everyone, welcome back to another journey through history's most uncomfortable truths. Tonight we're diving into something that makes medieval dentistry look like a spa-day childbirth in ancient Rome. So grab your favourite blanket, maybe light a candle that smells like something other than ancient medical procedures, and let's settle in for a tale that'll make you grateful for modern obstetrics. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy learning about the beautiful horrors of the past, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. It's always fascinating to see our little community of insomniacs and history lovers gathered from around the world, united in our shared appreciation for civilizations that somehow survived despite their best efforts to kill themselves through questionable medical practices. Now, turn down those lights. Maybe put on some soft background noise, perhaps the gentle hum of a fan. Definitely not the sound of ancient Roman birthing rooms. And let's ease into tonight's exploration of maternal mortality, divine intervention, and the miraculous fact that anyone survived to adulthood in the ancient world. Picture, if you will, the Roman Empire at its height, marble columns gleaming in Mediterranean sunlight, aqueducts carrying fresh water across impossible distances, roads stretching to the edges of the known world. A civilization so advanced they had central heating, public libraries, and a postal system that could deliver your complaints about gladiator fights to the far reaches of Britain. Yet, when it came to bringing new life into this magnificent world, their methods were, shall we say, charmingly primitive. Roman women approached childbirth the way their husbands approached barbarian invasions, with a mixture of religious fervour, practical preparation, and the quiet understanding that things might go very, very wrong. The birthing process wasn't just a medical event, it was a spiritual battlefield where life and death wrestled for supremacy, and the gods kept very detailed scorecards. Let's set the scene properly. You're a Roman matron, perhaps the wife of a senator or wealthy merchant. Your home is appointed with the finest furnishings. Money can buy imported silk from China, wine from the best vineyards in Gaul, servants who speak multiple languages and can prepare meals that would make modern chefs weep with envy. You have access to the best physicians, the most skilled midwives, and all the medical knowledge the ancient world could offer. And you're still more likely to die in childbirth than a modern woman giving birth in a field hospital during wartime. The irony is almost beautiful in its cruelty. Rome could engineer bridges that lasted millennia and calculate eclipses with stunning accuracy, but they couldn't figure out that maybe, just maybe, washing hands before delivering babies might be a good idea. They understood that lead pipes were poisonous well. Some of them did, but they thought the best way to ensure a safe delivery was to tie knots in your husband's clothing. Science and superstition danced together like drunk patricians at a Saturnalia feast, and the results were predictably chaotic. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To truly understand the Roman birthing experience, we need to start at the beginning, with a society that viewed pregnancy not as the natural biological process, but as a cosmic drama in which women played the starring role. Death lurked in the wings, and the audience, meaning everyone from the lowliest slave to the highest priest, had opinions about how the performance should go. The Romans, bless their organized hearts, approached everything systematically, including the creation of new citizens. They had gods for every conceivable aspect of human existence: Janus for doorways, Terminus for boundaries, Staculius for manure. Yes, really. So naturally they had an entire pantheon dedicated to the various stages of pregnancy and childbirth. It was like having a divine customer service department, except the hold music was temple chants, and your call might literally be a matter of life and death. Most Roman women spent their fertile years in a state of either being pregnant, nursing, or mourning children who hadn't survived. It was an exhausting cycle that started early. Girls were often married by 14, sometimes younger, and continued until menopause or death, whichever came first. The average Roman woman who survived to adulthood might have been pregnant 8 or 10 times. with perhaps half of those children living to see their 5th birthday. It was a numbers game played against odds that would make a Vegas casino blush. The wealthy, of course, had advantages: better food, cleaner water, access to educated physicians who had read actual Greek medical texts rather than just making things up as they went along. But even the richest Roman woman faced the same fundamental reality. Every pregnancy was a gamble with death, every birth a negotiation with forces beyond human control. The difference was that wealthy women could afford to lose the bet in more comfortable surroundings. Roman medical knowledge was a fascinating mixture of genuine insight and absolute nonsense, often combined in the same treatment. They understood anatomy well enough to perform complex surgeries, but thought that wearing amulets made from hyena skin would prevent miscarriage. They could set broken bones with remarkable skill, but believed that looking at ugly things during pregnancy would make your baby ugly. It was as if they had one foot in the future and the other firmly planted in the Bronze Age. The city of Rome itself, with its 1 million inhabitants, was a perfect laboratory for studying human reproduction under stressful conditions. Crowded apartment buildings, contaminated water sources, air thick with smoke from countless fires, and a social system that treated most women as walking wombs with limited legal rights. Yet somehow, life found a way. Children were born, families grew, and the empire expanded, fueled by the stubborn determination of women who refused to let little things like horrific medical practices and divine indifference stop them from creating the next generation. Roman law was surprisingly progressive in some ways. Women could own property, run businesses, and divorce their husbands if they felt like it. But when it came to childbirth, legal protections meant little. A woman in labour was entirely at the mercy of medical professionals, who might have learned their trade from reading scrolls written by men who had never attended a birth, or from midwives whose techniques had been passed down through generations without anyone questioning whether they actually worked. The Romans were great record keepers, meticulous in their documentation of everything from tax collection to gladiator statistics. Yet the stories of women in childbirth were rarely written down, considered too domestic, too feminine to warrant historical attention. We know more about the feeding habits of Caesar's war elephants than we do about how most Roman women experienced the most dangerous day of their lives. History, it seems, was written by men who found military campaigns more interesting than the biological campaigns fought in Roman bedrooms. What we do know comes to us in fragments medical texts that read like horror novels, tombstone inscriptions that tell stories of young wives who died in the flower of their youth, literary passages that mention childbirth the way they might mention a dangerous sea voyage or a risky business venture. These fragments paint a picture of a world where bringing life into existence was an act of extraordinary courage, performed by women who often had little choice in the matter. The Roman approach to childbirth was shaped by their understanding of the body as a battleground between competing forces, hot and cold, wet and dry, masculine and feminine. They believed that successful birth required achieving perfect balance among these elements, which could be accomplished through diet, exercise, prayers, sacrifices, and a bewildering array of herbal remedies that sometimes helped and sometimes accelerated the dying process. Roman physicians, trained in the theories of Greek masters like Hippocrates and Galen, approached pregnancy with the confidence of men who had read extensively about something they could never personally experience. They wrote detailed treatises on prenatal care, labour management, and postpartum recovery, dispensing advice with the authority of scholars and the practical experience of philosophers, debating the number of angels who could dance on the head of a pin. The reality, of course, was messier than the medical text suggested. Real women faced real complications that couldn't be solved by adjusting their humoral balance or sacrificing a goat to the appropriate deity. Breech presentations, prolonged labour, hemorrhaging, infection, the same problems that challenged modern medicine were death sentences in ancient Rome. dressed up in theoretical explanations that must have been cold comfort to dying women. Roman midwives, mostly slaves or freed women, carried the actual burden of managing births. They learned their trade through apprenticeship and experience rather than formal education, developing techniques that were sometimes remarkably effective and sometimes spectacularly dangerous. A skilled midwife was worth her weight in gold. An incompetent one could turn a difficult birth into a family tragedy with supernatural speed. The birthing room itself was a theatre of the absurd, crowded with relatives, servants, religious functionaries, and anyone else who felt they had a stake in the proceedings. Privacy was a luxury few could afford, and most women gave birth surrounded by audiences who offered advice, commentary, and moral support in roughly equal measure. It was like performing surgery in a public square, while passers-by shouted suggestions about which organ to remove next. Roman houses, designed around courtyards that let in light and air, seemed ideal for many activities, but weren't particularly well suited to medical emergencies. The birthing chamber might be the same room where the family dined, conducted business, or entertained guests. When labour began, furniture was rearranged, special chairs were brought in, and the domestic space transformed into something between a medical facility and a religious shrine. The Romans loved their rituals, and childbirth was no exception. Every stage of pregnancy and labour had its associated ceremonies, prayers, and protective measures. Expectant mothers wore amulets blessed by priests, consumed special foods prepared according to ancient recipes, and performed exercises designed to ensure an easy delivery. Whether any of these practices actually helped is debatable, but they provided psychological comfort in a world where maternal mortality was an accepted fact of life. Roman religion, with its practical approach to divine intervention, offered a buffet of gods and goddesses who specialized in various aspects of reproduction. Juno Lucina presided over childbirth itself, while Diana protected pregnant women during their vulnerable months. There were deities for conception, gestation, labor, delivery, and recovery, a celestial obstetrics team that ancient women could petition, bribe, or bargain with as circumstances required. The social pressure surrounding Roman childbirth was intense. Producing healthy children, especially sons, was considered a woman's primary duty to her family and the state. Failure to conceive, frequent miscarriages, or giving birth to children who didn't survive infancy brought shame not just to the woman, but to her entire household. It was a system that blamed victims for tragedies beyond their control, adding psychological trauma to physical suffering. Roman medicine, influenced by Greek theories and Egyptian practices, treated the human body as a complex machine that could be understood and repaired through rational analysis. This scientific approach was undermined by a parallel belief system that attributed illness and death to divine displeasure, cosmic imbalance, or simple bad luck. Physicians found themselves treating patients who expected both medical intervention and spiritual healing, often simultaneously. The economics of Roman childbirth varied dramatically by social class. Wealthy families could afford teams of specialist physicians, midwives, wet nurses, and servants trained in infant care. Poor families relied on neighborhood women who had survived their own pregnancies and were willing to share their experience. The difference in outcomes was predictable. Money couldn't guarantee survival, but poverty almost certainly guaranteed suffering. Roman women developed their own networks of support and information sharing, passing down knowledge about pregnancy, labor, and infant care through informal channels that operated parallel to official medical practice. These networks were essential for survival in a world where professional medical care was expensive, often ineffective, and sometimes more dangerous than no treatment at all. The Roman military, always practical in its approach to human resources, maintained detailed records of soldier health and casualty rates, but showed little interest in collecting similar data about civilian women and children. We know more about the medical treatment of wounded legionnaires than we do about the healthcare available to the mothers of future soldiers. It was a curious blind spot in a civilization otherwise obsessed with documentation and efficiency. Roman law reflected the empire's complex relationship with children and motherhood. Children were considered their father's property rather than independent individuals, and women had limited legal standing even in matters relating to their own bodies. A husband could divorce his wife for failing to produce children, but wives had little recourse if their husbands proved equally infertile. The law, like medicine, was written by men for the benefit of men. Yet despite all these challenges, the primitive medical knowledge, the dangerous practices, the social pressures, and the legal inequalities, Roman women continued to bear children and raise families. They developed strategies for survival that combined practical wisdom with stubborn optimism, creating informal support networks that helped them navigate the treacherous waters of ancient motherhood. The Roman approach to prenatal care was a mixture of common sense and cosmic nonsense that would amuse modern doctors if it weren't so tragically misguided. Pregnant women were advised to avoid certain foods, exercises, and activities, but the reasoning behind these restrictions often had more to do with superstition than science. Roman physicians believed that a woman's thoughts and experiences during pregnancy could directly influence her unborn child's development. Expectant mothers were encouraged to look at beautiful objects, listen to harmonious music, and surround themselves with positive influences. They were warned against witnessing violence, hearing bad news, or encountering anything ugly or disturbing. It was as if the fetus was constantly monitoring its mother's social media feed and adjusting its development accordingly. The Roman diet during pregnancy was carefully regulated according to medical theories that made sense to ancient physicians but would horrify modern nutritionists. Certain foods were considered hot or cold, not based on temperature, but on their supposed effects on the body's internal balance. Pregnant women might be forbidden from eating perfectly nutritious foods, while being encouraged to consume substances that we now know are harmful or useless. Roman exercise recommendations for pregnant women were similarly based on theoretical principles rather than empirical observation. Gentle walking was generally approved, but more vigorous activities were discouraged for fear of shaking loose the developing child. Some physicians recommended specific movements designed to position the baby correctly for birth, exercises that probably did more to exhaust the mother than help the infant. As we settle deeper into this exploration of ancient obstetrics, let's examine what happened when Roman women actually went into labour, and why the survival rate was roughly equivalent to volunteer work at Vesuvius. When a Roman woman felt those first unmistakable contractions, the machinery of ancient obstetrics creaked into motion with all the efficiency of a bureaucracy processing tax appeals during a barbarian invasion. Word spread through the household with lightning speed. Servants scurried to prepare the birthing chamber, and relatives began arriving as if someone had announced free bread in the forum. The birthing chair, that magnificent piece of furniture that would make modern torture museums proud, was ceremoniously brought forth from storage where it waited between pregnancies like a sleeping dragon. These chairs were marvels of Roman engineering, solid wood construction, precisely angled for optimal delivery positioning, and equipped with handles that labouring women could grip while contemplating their life choices. Roman birthing chairs came in various designs, from simple functional models used by the poor to elaborate affairs owned by wealthy families that featured ivory inlays, silver fittings, and upholstery that had probably witnessed more drama than the Colosseum. Some chairs were family heirlooms, passed down through generations of women who had either triumphed over them or been defeated by them, depending on how you defined victory in ancient obstetrics. The chair represented Roman ingenuity at its finest, a practical solution to a biological challenge that actually made sense from a mechanical perspective. The upright or semi-upright position allowed gravity to assist in delivery, the armrests provided leverage for pushing, and the open seat design gave attendants access to monitor progress. If Roman engineers had applied this level of thoughtful design to their plumbing, the empire might have lasted another 1,000 years. Professional midwives in Rome were skilled craftswomen who understood the birthing chair's capabilities and limitations. They knew how to position a woman for maximum effectiveness, when to encourage her to grip the handles and push, and how to recognize the signs that indicated whether the chair would be a chariot of triumph or a throne of tragedy. The best midwives developed reputations that spread throughout the city, and wealthy families competed to secure their services. The birthing chamber itself was transformed into a temple of controlled chaos, where science and superstition danced together like drunk senators at a victory celebration. Braziers burned sacred herbs, whose smoke was supposed to purify the air and ward off evil spirits, while also doing an excellent job of making everyone lightheaded and reducing visibility during critical moments. Roman physicians, when they deigned to attend births at all, brought with them an impressive array of instruments that looked like they'd been designed by someone who confused obstetrics with siege warfare. Bronze forceps, curved knives, hooks for extracting difficult presentations, and various tools whose purposes were better left unexamined. Most of these instruments spent their careers stored in leather cases, emerging only when situations had progressed beyond the realm of normal complications. The social hierarchy of the birthing room reflected Roman society in miniature. The labouring woman occupied the central position, quite literally, but was surrounded by layers of authority and expertise that determined how her experience would unfold. Senior family matrons offered advice based on their own survival stories, while younger relatives watched and learned for their own future ordeals. Slave attendants performed the practical work heating water, preparing clean linens, fetching supplies, and maintaining the sacred fires that burned throughout labour. These women often had extensive experience with childbirth, having assisted at multiple deliveries, but their knowledge was rarely acknowledged or respected by their social superiors. They were the unsung heroes of Roman obstetrics, keeping the machinery running, while others took credit for successful outcomes. Religious officials might be summoned to perform protective rituals, offer prayers to appropriate deities, or conduct ceremonies designed to ensure divine favour for the proceedings. The line between medicine and religion was essentially non-existent in ancient Rome. Physicians were expected to be as skilled at invoking gods as they were at manipulating anatomy. The Roman approach to labour management emphasised patience, endurance, and acceptance of divine will, combined with practical interventions that sometimes helped and sometimes hastened disaster. Women were encouraged to remain calm, breathe properly, and trust in the expertise of their attendants. Pain relief consisted mainly of herbal preparations that might dull sensation while also clouding judgment at crucial moments. Timing was everything in Roman childbirth, and midwives developed sophisticated methods for monitoring labour progress without the benefit of modern measuring instruments. They relied on observation, experience, and intuition to determine when interventions were necessary, when to encourage pushing, and when to prepare for complications that could turn a normal delivery into a medical emergency. The Roman birth attendant's toolkit included an impressive pharmacopoeia of herbal remedies, many of which were actually effective. Willow bark for pain relief, got preparations to strengthen contractions, and various teas and tinctures that could either speed labour or slow it down, depending on what the situation required. The knowledge of which herbs to use and when represented generations of accumulated wisdom, tested through trial and error that probably killed as many women as it saved. Roman obstetrics recognized that successful delivery required teamwork, coordination, and clear communication among attendants who might not share common languages or social backgrounds. The birthing chamber became a temporary community where Egyptian slaves, Greek physicians, Roman matrons, and Germanic wet nurses worked together toward a common goal, setting aside cultural differences in the face of biological imperatives. The wealthy Roman matron approaching labour could expect to be attended by the best medical professionals money could buy, surrounded by experienced women who had survived their own deliveries, and protected by religious ceremonies that invoked every deity remotely connected to successful childbirth. She had access to comfortable furnishings, nutritious foods, and pain-relieving preparations that were denied to poorer women. Yet, even with all these advantages, Roman childbirth remained fundamentally dangerous. The same complications that threatened slave women could kill aristocrats just as efficiently. Wealth could improve your odds and certainly made suffering more comfortable, but it couldn't eliminate the basic risks inherent in bringing new life into a world where medical knowledge was incomplete and infection control was non-existent. Roman record-keeping, so meticulous in other areas, becomes frustratingly vague when it comes to documenting birth outcomes. We have detailed accounts of gladiator fights, military campaigns, and tax collection, but the survival rates of Roman women in childbirth must be inferred from tombstone inscriptions and scattered literary references. It's as if an entire civilization agreed to look the other way, while half the population risked death to continue the species. The psychological preparation for Roman childbirth began early, as young girls watched their mothers, sisters, and neighbors navigate pregnancy and labor. They absorbed lessons about endurance, acceptance, and the importance of fulfilling their reproductive duties, regardless of personal cost. By the time they faced their own first pregnancy, Roman women understood that survival was not guaranteed and that courage was not optional. Roman medical texts describe ideal labor scenarios with the confidence of theorists who had read extensively about processes they could never personally experience. These descriptions emphasize proper positioning, appropriate timing, and the importance of maintaining calm throughout the proceedings. Reality, of course, was considerably messier than the textbooks suggested. The Roman birthing chair represented the pinnacle of ancient obstetric technology, a piece of equipment that actually improved outcomes for many women, while serving as a grim reminder of how primitive their medical knowledge remained. It was a symbol of human ingenuity applied to biological necessity, and it worked better than most Roman medical interventions, which admittedly set a fairly low bar for success. Roman families invested heavily in birthing equipment and preparations, understanding that their genetic future depended on successfully navigating the dangerous waters of childbirth. Wealthy households maintained complete sets of obstetric supplies, employed permanent staff trained in birth assistance, and established relationships with the best medical professionals available. The cultural significance of the birthing chair extended beyond its practical function. It represented continuity, tradition, and the connection between generations of women who had faced the same biological challenges. Mothers passed these chairs to daughters, along with accumulated wisdom about their use and the stories of those who had found triumph or tragedy in their embrace. Roman engineering principles, so successful in building aqueducts and roads, were applied to obstetric equipment with mixed results. The birthing chair worked because it aligned with natural forces rather than fighting them. But other Roman medical devices seemed designed by people who had read about human anatomy in poorly translated texts without ever seeing an actual body. The Roman obstetric toolkit extended far beyond the birthing chair to include an array of specialized equipment that reveals both the sophistication of their medical thinking and the fundamental limitations of their anatomical knowledge. Bronze speculums, designed for examining the birth canal, were crafted with the precision of fine jewelry, yet used without understanding of infection control, creating instruments that were beautiful to look at and dangerous to use. Roman midwives carried leather satchels filled with an impressive array of tools, curved scissors for cutting umbilical cords, bronze hooks for managing difficult presentations, small knives for performing episiotomies, and various clamps and forceps that looked more like jewelry than medical instruments. These tools were often family heirlooms, passed down through generations of birth attendants, who added their own innovations and modifications. The Roman approach to umbilical cord management involved elaborate rituals that combined practical necessity with religious symbolism. The cord was cut using bronze knives that had been blessed by priests. tied with threads that had been woven by virgins, and the severed portion was either burned in sacred fires or buried in locations determined by augury. The Romans understood that proper cord care was essential for infant survival, but they embedded this knowledge in ceremonies that made medical procedures look like religious pageants. Roman birthing rooms were equipped with a specialized furniture beyond the famous chairs, low stools for attendants, tables for instruments and supplies, braziers for heating water and burning incense, and storage chests containing linens, herbs, and emergency supplies. These rooms were designed as complete medical suites, though their effectiveness was limited by the primitive understandings of hygiene and infection control. The Roman system of pain management during labor relied heavily on herbal preparations that were administered according to complex timing protocols that physicians had developed through centuries of trial and error. Poppy extracts for severe pain, willow bark preparations for fever, and various herbal teas designed to strengthen contractions or relax muscles. Some of these remedies were genuinely effective, others were harmless placebos, and a few were actively dangerous compounds that physicians prescribed with confidence born of ignorance. Roman birthing attendants developed sophisticated non-verbal communication systems that allowed them to coordinate care without alarming laboring women or interfering with religious ceremonies that might be occurring simultaneously. Hand signals, eye contact, and positioning cues enabled teams of midwives, physicians, and assistants to work together efficiently, even when they spoke different languages or came from different cultural backgrounds. The Roman approach to managing labor pain included physical techniques that were surprisingly advanced for their time, massage methods that provided genuine relief, positioning strategies that reduce pressure on painful areas, and breathing exercises that help women maintain control during difficult contractions. These techniques were developed through practical experience rather than theoretical knowledge, representing genuine medical wisdom that emerged from careful observation of what actually worked. Roman physicians classified different types of labor pain according to theoretical frameworks that attempted to explain why some women suffered more than others during childbirth. They attributed variations in pain intensity to differences in humoral balance, spiritual purity, and physical constitution, creating explanatory systems that were intellectually satisfying but medically useless for predicting or managing actual labor experiences. The Roman understanding of fetal monitoring was remarkably sophisticated for a civilization without modern technology. Midwives learned to assess fetal well-being through careful observation of maternal signs, changes in labor patterns, and subtle indicators that required years of experience to recognize and interpret correctly. This knowledge was transmitted through apprenticeship systems that created genuine expertise, despite the lack of formal medical education. Roman birthing protocols included detailed procedures for managing different stages of labor, from early contractions through delivery of the placenta. These protocols were based on accumulated experience rather than theoretical knowledge, representing practical wisdom that had been refined through generations of trial and error that unfortunately included a substantial number of errors that proved fatal. The Roman approach to managing multiple births reflected their understanding that twins and higher-order multiples presented special challenges that required different techniques and equipment. They developed specialized birthing chairs designed for multiple births, modified positioning strategies, and team approaches that assigned different attendants to monitor each baby during delivery. The survival rates for multiple births were still appallingly low, but Roman physicians at least recognized that these situations required special handling. Roman obstetric education included formal apprenticeships, where young midwives learned by observing experienced practitioners during actual deliveries. These educational experiences were intense, hands-on programs that created genuine expertise, but also transmitted dangerous misconceptions along with useful knowledge. Students learned what worked and what didn't through direct observation, though they didn't always understand why certain techniques were effective or dangerous. The Roman development of obstetric instruments reflected their broader approach to medical technology, sophisticated manufacturing techniques applied to devices whose function was poorly understood. Bronze forceps were crafted with the precision of fine artwork, featuring adjustable grips, precisely angled surfaces, and decorative elements that made them suitable for display in wealthy households when they weren't being used to extract babies from desperate situations. Roman birthing attendants developed specialized skills in managing breech presentations, shoulder dystocia, and other complications that required manual intervention. These skills were learned through mentorship programs, where experienced midwives taught younger practitioners how to recognize problems early and intervene effectively before situations became fatal. The training was thorough, but limited by the fundamental lack of understanding about anatomy and physiology. The Roman approach to postpartum care included detailed protocols for monitoring new mothers during the dangerous days and weeks following delivery. Attendants watched for signs of infection, hemorrhage, and other complications while providing nutritional support, herbal treatments, and emotional care that helped women recover from the trauma of childbirth. This postpartum care was often more effective than their labor management, possibly because it involved less active intervention. Roman physicians wrote detailed treatises on recognizing and managing obstetric emergencies, creating medical literature that provided theoretical frameworks for understanding complications, even when the available treatments were inadequate. These texts reveal both the sophistication of Roman medical thinking and the tragic limitations of their therapeutic options when faced with serious problems. The Roman system of medical consultation during difficult labors involved protocols for summoning additional expertise when primary attendants encountered situations beyond their experience. Senior physicians, religious authorities, and experienced midwives could be called to provide second opinions, additional hands, or specialized knowledge that might make the difference between life and death in critical situations. Roman birthing chambers were designed with acoustic considerations that allowed attendants to communicate effectively while minimizing noise that might disturb laboring women or interfere with religious ceremonies. The placement of furniture, selection of materials, and architectural features all reflected understanding that successful labor management required careful coordination among team members who needed to work together seamlessly. The Roman approach to managing family dynamics during labor included strategies for dealing with anxious relatives, managing expectations, and maintaining calm in situations where emotions ran high and outcomes were uncertain. Experienced birth attendants learned diplomatic skills that were as important as medical knowledge for managing the complex social situations that surrounded every delivery. Roman medical supply management for obstetric care involved maintaining inventories of essential materials, ensuring that supplies remained fresh and effective, and developing backup plans for situations where standard materials were unavailable. This logistical planning was essential for providing consistent care in a world where transportation was slow and supply chains were unreliable. The Roman understanding of nutrition during pregnancy and childbirth led to detailed dietary recommendations that were based on theoretical principles rather than empirical observation. Pregnant women were advised to eat specific foods at particular times, avoid certain combinations of ingredients, and follow complex eating schedules that were supposed to optimize conditions for successful delivery. Some of these recommendations were actually beneficial, others were harmless nonsense, and a few were actively dangerous. Roman birthing attendants developed expertise in recognizing the early signs of labor, distinguishing true contractions from false labor, and timing interventions to maximize their effectiveness. This diagnostic skill was essential for determining when to summon additional help, when to begin active management, and when to prepare for emergency procedures that might be needed if normal labor failed to progress. As Roman civilization spread throughout the Mediterranean world, their birthing practices spread with them, carried by colonists, soldiers' wives, and enslaved women who brought their knowledge to new territories. Roman obstetrics became a unifying force across the empire, creating shared experiences among women who might otherwise have nothing in common. The success of Roman birthing chairs led to variations and improvements as craftsmen competed to create better, more comfortable, and more effective designs. Some featured adjustable components, others included special cushions or supports, and the most elaborate models became works of art that served both functional and ceremonial purposes. Roman physicians wrote extensively about proper birthing chair positioning, optimal angles for different types of deliveries, and techniques for assisting women who struggled with the equipment. These medical texts treat the chairs as precision instruments that required skill and experience to operate effectively, which was probably closer to the truth than their authors realized. The social dynamics surrounding birthing chair use reflected broader patterns of Roman gender relations, class distinctions, and cultural values. Who sat in the chair, who attended the birth, and how the proceedings were conducted all carried meaning that extended far beyond the immediate medical situation. Roman women developed their own traditions and rituals surrounding birthing chair preparation, often incorporating family customs that had been passed down through generations. These practices provided psychological comfort and created a sense of connection with ancestors who had faced the same challenges under similar circumstances. The maintenance and care of birthing chairs became an important responsibility, usually assigned to trusted servants or female relatives who understood their significance and value. These pieces of furniture were carefully preserved between uses, stored in special locations, and treated with the respect due to instruments that could mean the difference between life and death. Roman military wives faced unique challenges when it came to birthing chair access, often finding themselves far from home without familiar equipment or attendants. Portable chairs were developed for families who traveled frequently, though these simplified versions lacked the stability and features of permanent household furniture. The economics of birthing chair ownership created a rental market among Roman families who couldn't afford their own equipment, but wanted to provide their daughters with the best possible birthing experience. Wealthy women sometimes lent their chairs to poorer relatives or friends, creating networks of mutual support that transcended social boundaries. Roman religious authorities blessed birthing chairs and incorporated them into ceremonies designed to ensure divine protection for laboring women. These consecrated pieces of furniture were believed to carry spiritual power that complemented their mechanical effectiveness, providing both practical assistance and psychological comfort. The cultural legacy of Roman birthing chairs extended far beyond the fall of the empire, influencing obstetric practices throughout medieval Europe and serving as ancestors to modern delivery equipment. Roman engineering principles, refined through centuries of trial and error, provided foundations for improvements that continued long after the last legions had marched home. As we transition from the glory days of Roman obstetric innovation to the harsh realities of what actually happened when women climbed into those magnificent chairs, we begin to see how even the best ancient technology could only do so much against the fundamental dangers of childbirth in a world without antibiotics, anesthesia, or understanding of infection control. The moment of truth arrived when contractions intensified and the carefully orchestrated theatre of Roman childbirth began to reveal its fundamental flaws. Like discovering that your magnificent aqueduct has been channeling sewage instead of fresh water for the past 6 months. No amount of preparation, prayer, or expensive medical equipment could overcome the basic reality that Roman obstetrics was essentially educated guesswork performed by people who thought the best cure for fever was bloodletting. Roman physicians approached difficult labours with the confidence of generals planning military campaigns, completely unaware that they were essentially throwing darts blindfolded while riding backwards on a chariot. They had theories about everything: why labour sometimes stopped progressing, what caused babies to present incorrectly, how to manage bleeding, but their theories were based on philosophical principles rather than empirical observation. which is a polite way of saying they made things up and hoped for the best. The first sign that things were going wrong usually manifested as prolonged labour, which Roman medical texts attributed to everything from planetary misalignment to the mother's failure to maintain proper moral conduct during pregnancy. Modern medicine recognises dozens of potential causes for delayed labour, most of which can be managed with appropriate interventions. Roman medicine recognised one cause, insufficient divine favour, and recommended solutions that ranged from useless to actively harmful. When labour failed to progress normally, Roman midwives consulted their arsenal of traditional remedies with the enthusiasm of cookbook authors trying to salvage a dinner party after discovering the main course had spoiled. They might administer herbal preparations to strengthen contractions, position the woman differently on her birthing chair, or perform massage techniques that had been passed down through generations of practitioners who survived long enough to share their experience. Roman religious intervention intensified as medical solutions proved inadequate, transforming the birthing chamber into something resembling a theological emergency room where priests competed with physicians for authority over the proceedings. Prayers were offered to increasingly obscure deities, sacrifices were promised for favourable outcomes, and amulets were applied to body parts that probably didn't appreciate the attention. The Roman understanding of fetal positioning was remarkably sophisticated for its time, recognizing that babies could present in various ways that affected delivery difficulty. Roman midwives developed techniques for attempting to correct unfavorable presentations through external manipulation, procedures that sometimes worked and sometimes turned manageable situations into medical disasters with impressive efficiency. Roman obstetric instruments, those bronze marvels that looked like torture devices designed by someone with a grudge against anatomy, were typically reserved for emergency situations when traditional methods had failed. The decision to use instruments was essentially an admission that divine intervention had been unsuccessful, and that mechanical intervention might succeed where prayer had failed, which tells you everything you need to know about Roman medical priorities. The use of forceps in Roman obstetrics was a delicate art that required skill, experience, and considerable luck to avoid causing more damage than benefit. Roman physicians understood that these instruments could save lives when used correctly, but could also inflict injuries that made death a mercy rather than a tragedy. The best practitioners used forceps sparingly and with great care. The worst treated them like can openers for reluctant babies. Roman hemorrhage management consisted largely of pressure, elevation, and prayer, supplemented by herbal preparations that might slow bleeding or might accelerate the dying process, depending on which herbs were selected and how they were prepared. The Roman understanding of circulation was primitive at best, and their treatments for severe bleeding reflected their ignorance with sometimes tragic consequences. Infection control in Roman birthing chambers was essentially non-existent, based on the assumption that cleanliness was more about aesthetics than health. Attendants moved freely between patients without washing their hands. Instruments were reused without proper cleaning, and contaminated materials were handled with cheerful disregard for the microscopic armies of bacteria that were busily colonizing everything in sight. The Roman approach to managing prolonged labor involved a combination of physical interventions, pharmaceutical preparations, and religious ceremonies that created an atmosphere of controlled panic, barely disguised as medical professionalism. Women might be encouraged to walk, change positions, or perform exercises designed to encourage labor progress, while simultaneously being dosed with herbal preparations whose effects were poorly understood. Roman midwives recognized the signs of fetal distress, but had limited options for responding to these emergencies. They could attempt to expedite delivery through various means, but their interventions often caused additional trauma to both mother and child. The decision-making process resembled medical triage performed by people who had read about anatomy in books written by authors who had never seen a human body dissected. The social pressure surrounding difficult labours intensified as time passed, and normal delivery seemed increasingly unlikely. Family members, religious officials, and medical attendants all had opinions about what should be done next, creating a committee approach to emergency obstetrics that prioritized consensus building over rapid intervention. Democracy, it turns out, is not always the best approach to medical emergencies. Roman pain management during difficult labours consisted mainly of herbal preparations that might provide some relief, while also clouding judgment at precisely the moments when clear thinking was most crucial. Women were encouraged to endure pain as a natural part of the birthing process, with the understanding that excessive suffering might indicate divine displeasure with their moral conduct. The economics of prolonged labour created additional stress for families who were paying for extended medical services, while watching their loved ones suffer without obvious improvement. Wealthy families could afford to continue treatments indefinitely, while poorer families faced difficult decisions about when to stop investing in interventions that weren't working and might never work. Roman medical consultation during obstetric emergencies resembled committee meetings, where participants debated theoretical principles, while patients bled, suffered, and occasionally died, waiting for decisions to be reached. Multiple physicians might be summoned for difficult cases, each bringing his own theories and preferred treatments, creating situations where too many experts spoiled the birthing broth. The Roman approach to breech presentations involved techniques that were sometimes effective and sometimes catastrophic, depending on the skill of the practitioner and the cooperation of the patient. Midwives might attempt external version to correct fetal position, or they might proceed with breech delivery using methods that required considerable courage from both attendant and mother. Roman obstetric complications were classified according to theoretical frameworks that made sense to ancient physicians but would mystify modern doctors. Problems were attributed to humoral imbalances, atmospheric conditions, or spiritual deficiencies rather than mechanical, infectious, or genetic causes. Treatment followed logically from diagnosis, which explains why Roman treatments often seemed disconnected from reality. The psychological impact of difficult labour on Roman women was intensified by their understanding that prolonged suffering might indicate personal moral failings or divine displeasure with their conduct. They faced not only physical pain and medical danger, but also the social shame of appearing to be unworthy of divine assistance in fulfilling their reproductive duties. Roman attendants during difficult labours often found themselves managing family dynamics as much as medical emergencies, as relatives offered advice, criticism, and commentary that reflected their own anxieties about outcomes that could affect the entire household. The birthing chamber became a stage where multiple dramas played out simultaneously, with the labouring woman at the centre of proceedings she couldn't control. The Roman documentation of obstetric complications was frustratingly incomplete, focusing on theoretical explanations rather than practical outcomes. Medical texts describe ideal scenarios and proper procedures, but rarely acknowledge the frequency with which these procedures failed, or the consequences of failure for the women involved. Roman midwifery training emphasized traditional techniques passed down through generations of practitioners, but this apprenticeship system meant that errors and misconceptions were transmitted along with genuine knowledge. Young midwives learned by observing their mentors, absorbing both useful skills and harmful practices, without necessarily understanding which was which. The Roman approach to managing obstetric emergencies reflected their broader cultural values about endurance, acceptance of divine will, and the importance of maintaining social order even in crisis situations. Women were expected to suffer gracefully. Attendants were supposed to remain optimistic regardless of circumstances, and families were required to maintain dignity even when facing tragedy. Roman pharmaceutical preparations for difficult labour included substances that we now know were dangerous or useless, administered by people who believed in their effectiveness based on traditional knowledge rather than empirical testing. The placebo effect probably provided some benefit, but it couldn't overcome the fundamental limitations of ancient pharmacology. The Roman understanding of when to abandon curative efforts and focus on comfort care was influenced by social, economic, and religious factors as much as medical considerations. Decisions about continuing or discontinuing treatment reflected family resources, social status, and religious beliefs, rather than purely medical assessments of prognosis. Roman obstetric practice during the empire's decline period reflected broader social and economic stresses that affected the quality of medical care available to most women. As resources became scarcer and social stability decreased, the gap between medical care for wealthy and poor women widened, creating disparities in outcomes that reflected broader social inequalities. The Roman legacy in obstetrics was a mixture of genuine innovations, like the birthing chair, and persistent misconceptions that would continue to influence medical practice long after the fall of the empire. Their systematic approach to documentation and classification provided foundations for later improvements, even when their specific techniques proved harmful or ineffective. As Roman civilization faced internal and external pressures that threatened its stability, the quality of medical care for women in childbirth deteriorated along with other social services. The expertise that had been carefully cultivated over centuries was gradually lost as economic hardship and political chaos disrupted the institutions that had supported medical training and practice. The decline of Roman obstetrics was not a sudden collapse, but a gradual erosion of knowledge, resources, and institutional support that left later generations with fragments of ancient wisdom mixed with harmful practices that persisted long after their theoretical foundations had been forgotten. It was a cautionary tale about how medical progress can be reversed when social conditions deteriorate and institutional knowledge is lost. Now we arrive at the part of our story where Roman childbirth reveals its true nature, stripping away the marble facades and philosophical pretensions to expose a medical reality so gruesome it makes medieval surgery look like a relaxing spa treatment performed by trained professionals with actual knowledge of human anatomy. Roman birthing chambers, despite their careful preparation and religious sanctification, regularly transformed into scenes that would have made battlefield surgeons reach for stronger wine. Blood was everywhere on the birthing chair, soaking through layers of carefully prepared linens, pooling on mosaic floors that had been designed to showcase the family's wealth, rather than facilitate cleanup after obstetric emergencies. The Roman approach to managing hemorrhage during childbirth combined practical pressure techniques with magical thinking in proportions that defied logic. Like treating a severed artery by applying bandages blessed by priests who had never seen the inside of a human body. Midwives pressed clean cloths against bleeding wounds, while chanting prayers to Juno Lucina, hoping that divine intervention would accomplish what their limited medical knowledge could not. The smell of Roman birthing chambers during difficult deliveries was an assault on the senses that combined blood, sweat, burning herbs, and the unmistakable odor of human fear. Braziers filled with sacred plants created clouds of aromatic smoke that was supposed to purify the air and ward off evil spirits, but mostly succeeded in making everyone dizzy and reducing visibility during critical moments when clear sight was essential. Roman medical instruments, those bronze masterpieces of intimidating design, were often used without proper cleaning between patients, spreading infections with the efficiency of a plague carrier making house calls. The concept of sterilization was completely unknown, and instruments were considered clean if they looked clean, which explains why so many women who survived the actual birthing process died later from infections that modern medicine could prevent with basic hygiene. The Roman understanding of anatomy was based largely on the dissection of animals, since human dissection was generally forbidden, which meant that physicians approached human childbirth with knowledge gained from examining pigs and sheep. The results were predictably disastrous, as treatments that made sense when applied to livestock proved less effective when used on actual human beings with their inconveniently different anatomical arrangements. Roman pharmaceutical preparations for childbirth included substances that we now know were actively harmful, administered with confidence born of ignorance and tradition. Lead-based preparations were used to treat various complications. Mercury compounds were employed as antiseptics, and herbal mixtures that contained toxic plants were prescribed based on theoretical principles that had no basis in reality. The Roman approach to retained placenta involved manual extraction techniques that were performed without anesthesia, proper instruments, or understanding of infection control. Midwives would insert their unwashed hands into the uterus to remove placental fragments, often causing additional trauma and introducing bacteria that led to infections that killed women days or weeks after apparently successful deliveries. Roman obstetric forceps, when they were used, often caused more damage than benefit due to their crude design and the limited understanding of how to use them safely. These bronze instruments could crush fetal skulls, tear maternal tissues, and cause internal injuries that led to slow, agonizing deaths for both mothers and children. The decision to use forceps was essentially a choice between certain suffering and possible survival. The Roman practice of episiotomy, cutting the perineum to enlarge the birth opening, was performed with knives that had been used for other purposes and were rarely properly cleaned. These procedures were conducted without anesthesia, using instruments that were more suitable for kitchen work than surgery, by practitioners whose knowledge of anatomy was theoretical at best. Roman caesarean sections were exclusively post-mortem procedures, performed only after the mother had died in an attempt to save the child. These emergency surgeries were conducted by attendants who had little understanding of internal anatomy, using techniques that were more like butchery than medicine. The survival rate for infants delivered by caesarean section was approximately 0, but Roman law required the attempt. The Roman treatment of prolapsed umbilical cord involved techniques that were sometimes effective and sometimes catastrophic, depending on the skill of the practitioner and sheer luck. Midwives might attempt to reposition the cord manually, often causing additional complications that turned manageable emergencies into fatal disasters with impressive speed. Roman infection control consisted mainly of burning aromatic herbs and hoping that pleasant smells would overcome the disease-causing properties of contaminated environments. The connection between cleanliness and health was not understood, and birthing chambers regularly became breeding grounds for bacteria that killed more women than difficult deliveries. The Roman approach to managing eclampsia and other pregnancy-related seizure disorders involved restraining the convulsing woman and attempting to prevent her from injuring herself, while priests performed exorcism rituals to drive out the evil spirits that were obviously causing the problem. Medical intervention consisted mainly of bloodletting, which probably accelerated death rather than prevented it. Roman pain management during childbirth relied on herbal preparations that were often more dangerous than helpful, including opium-based mixtures that could suppress respiration and alcohol-based tinctures that caused dehydration and impaired judgment. Women were encouraged to endure pain as a natural part of the birthing process, with the understanding that excessive suffering indicated divine displeasure. The Roman practice of attempting to reposition breech babies involved external manipulation techniques that could cause uterine rupture, placental separation, or cord compression. These procedures were performed by midwives, who learned through trial and error, which meant that errors were often fatal for both mother and child before the practitioner gained sufficient experience. Roman birthing stools, despite their practical design, became contaminated with blood and other bodily fluids that were never properly cleaned between uses. These chairs served multiple women in succession, spreading infections and diseases with the efficiency of a medieval plague vector disguised as medical equipment. The Roman approach to managing fetal death in utero involved extraction techniques that were primitive, dangerous, and often ineffective. Dead fetuses were removed using hooks, knives, and other instruments that caused massive trauma to maternal tissues, leading to infections and internal injuries that frequently proved fatal. Roman midwives often resorted to desperate measures when standard techniques failed, including the use of primitive surgical procedures that were performed without proper instruments, anesthesia, or understanding of sterile technique. These interventions usually hastened death rather than prevented it, but they provided the illusion of medical action when circumstances demanded that something be done. The Roman understanding of postpartum hemorrhage was limited to applying pressure and hoping for divine intervention, with no comprehension of the underlying causes or effective treatments. Women bled to death while attendants performed increasingly frantic rituals designed to appease gods, who seemed to have lost interest in obstetric emergencies. Roman treatment of puerperal sepsis, the infection that killed many women in the days following delivery, consisted mainly of bloodletting and herbal preparations that were ineffective against bacterial infections. The Roman medical system had no concept of antibiotics, antiseptics, or the bacterial theory of disease, leaving women defenseless against infections that modern medicine can cure with simple treatments. The Roman practice of attempting to speed labor through the use of ergot and other dangerous substances often caused uterine rupture, uncontrollable bleeding, and fetal death. These drugs were administered without understanding of proper dosage, timing, or contraindications, turning potentially helpful medicines into instruments of destruction. Roman birthing chambers were often shared by multiple women giving birth simultaneously, creating environments where diseases and infections spread rapidly among vulnerable patients. The concept of isolation or quarantine was unknown, and sick women were mixed with healthy ones in arrangements that maximized the transmission of deadly pathogens. The Roman understanding of what we now call postpartum hemorrhage was limited to the observation that women sometimes bled to death after apparently successful deliveries, a phenomenon they attributed to divine displeasure or incomplete cleansing of the womb. Their treatments included packing the uterus with herbs and cloth, applying pressure to the abdomen, and elevating the woman's legs while priests performed increasingly desperate rituals to appease whatever gods might be responsible for the bleeding. Roman physicians developed an elaborate classification system for different types of abnormal bleeding during and after childbirth, creating categories that reflected their theoretical understanding of humoral imbalances rather than actual pathophysiology. They distinguished between hot bleeding caused by excess fire in the body and cold bleeding attributed to an abundance of phlegm, prescribing treatments that were supposed to restore proper balance, but usually accelerated the dying process. The Roman approach to managing what modern medicine recognizes as eclampsia involved restraining and convulsing women to prevent injury while attributing their seizures to demonic possession or divine punishment for moral failings. Exorcism rituals were performed alongside medical treatments that included bloodletting, purging, and the administration of herbal preparations that probably worsened the underlying condition while providing the illusion of therapeutic intervention. Roman midwives developed techniques for manually extracting retained placental fragments, procedures that were performed without anesthesia, sterile instruments, or understanding of anatomy. These interventions often caused additional trauma and introduced infections that killed women who might have survived if left alone. But the Roman medical system valued active intervention over passive observation, even when activity hastened death. The Roman practice of attempting to reposition malpositioned babies through external manipulation often resulted in uterine rupture, placental abruption, or cord compression that killed both mother and child. These procedures were performed by midwives who had learned through apprenticeship systems that transmitted techniques without explaining the anatomical principles that made them dangerous when performed incorrectly. Roman birthing attendants regularly encountered situations where babies became stuck during delivery, conditions that modern medicine manages through careful technique and sometimes surgical intervention. Roman solutions involved the use of hooks, forceps, and other instruments that were designed to extract babies by force rather than finesse, often resulting in injuries that proved fatal to both mother and child. The Roman approach to managing premature labour involved treatments that were supposed to strengthen the womb and prevent early delivery. But these interventions often included substances that we now know could cause birth defects or fetal death. Herbal preparations containing ergot compounds, heavy metals, and other toxic substances were administered to pregnant women based on theoretical principles that had no basis in empirical observation. Roman physicians recognized that some women experienced repeated pregnancy losses, a pattern they attributed to weakness of constitution, moral deficiency, or cursed bloodlines, rather than medical conditions that might be treatable. These women were subjected to increasingly desperate interventions, including bloodletting, purging, dietary restrictions, and religious ceremonies that probably worsened their underlying problems while providing false hope for future pregnancies. The Roman understanding of infection was virtually non-existent, leading to practices that actively spread disease among women who were already vulnerable due to pregnancy and childbirth. Instruments were reused without cleaning, attendants moved between patients without washing their hands, and contaminated materials were handled with complete disregard for the microscopic organisms that were busily multiplying in every available surface. Roman treatment of what we now recognize as puerperal sepsis consisted mainly of bloodletting and herbal preparations that were ineffective against bacterial infections. Women developed fevers, became delirious, and died in agony while their families watched helplessly, and physicians offered increasingly elaborate explanations for conditions they couldn't understand or treat effectively. The Roman approach to managing difficult presentations included the use of version techniques that involved inserting hands into the uterus to manually rotate babies into more favorable positions. These procedures were performed without anesthesia, sterile technique, or adequate understanding of anatomy, often causing injuries that were more dangerous than the original problems they were intended to solve. Roman birthing attendants encountered situations where labour failed to progress despite normal contractions, conditions that required careful assessment and sometimes surgical intervention. Roman solutions involved the administration of increasingly powerful herbal preparations designed to strengthen contractions, but these treatments often caused uterine rupture or other complications that proved fatal to both mother and child. The Roman practice of attempting to induce labour using mechanical stimulation, herbal preparations, and physical manipulation often resulted in complications that were worse than continued pregnancy. These induction techniques were performed without understanding of fetal maturity, cervical readiness, or the risks associated with premature intervention, leading to outcomes that might have been avoided with patience and better knowledge. Roman physicians developed theories about the causes of stillbirth that reflected their understanding of divine justice rather than medical pathology. They attributed fetal death to maternal moral failings, paternal sins, or supernatural influences rather than recognizing the medical conditions that actually caused these tragedies. This theological approach to obstetric complications prevented the development of effective treatments while adding psychological trauma to physical suffering. The Roman approach to managing shoulder dystocia involved traction techniques that often resulted in permanent nerve damage, fractures, or death for both mother and child. These procedures were performed by attendants who understood that babies sometimes became stuck during delivery, but lacked the anatomical knowledge needed to manage these emergencies safely and effectively. Roman midwives regularly encountered situations where babies were born with the umbilical cord wrapped around their necks, conditions that required quick thinking and skilled intervention. Roman techniques for managing cord entanglement often involved cutting the cord before delivery was complete, a practice that could cause severe bleeding and other complications that proved fatal to both mother and child. The Roman understanding of fetal distress was limited to recognizing that labor sometimes slowed or stopped without obvious explanation, phenomena they attributed to divine intervention or supernatural influences, rather than medical conditions affecting the baby's well-being. Their treatments focused on appeasing gods and adjusting maternal behavior rather than addressing the underlying problems that were actually causing fetal compromise. Roman physicians recognized that some deliveries resulted in extensive tearing of maternal tissues, injuries that required repair to prevent infection and promote healing. However, their surgical techniques were primitive, their instruments were crude, and their understanding of anatomy was inadequate for performing effective repairs that would heal properly without causing additional complications. The Roman approach to managing postpartum depression and other psychological complications involved attributing mental symptoms to divine punishment or moral weakness, rather than recognizing them as medical conditions requiring treatment. Women who suffered from these conditions were often blamed for their symptoms and subjected to religious rituals, rather than receiving the emotional support and medical care they needed for recovery. Roman birthing chambers became repositories of accumulated contamination that created environments increasingly hostile to human health with each successive use. Blood, bodily fluids, and other organic matter accumulated in cracks and crevices, where they provided ideal breeding grounds for the bacteria that would kill future patients who had the misfortune to deliver in these supposedly sacred spaces. The Roman practice of attempting to prevent miscarriage through the use of amulets, dietary restrictions, and behavioral modifications often subjected women to unnecessary stress and deprivation that probably increased their risk of pregnancy loss. These preventive measures were based on superstition rather than medical knowledge, creating false hope while failing to address the underlying causes of recurrent pregnancy loss. Roman physicians developed elaborate protocols for managing the various stages of labor, but these procedures were based on theoretical principles rather than empirical observation of what actually worked. The result was a system of obstetric care that was internally consistent but externally ineffective, providing the appearance of medical sophistication while delivering outcomes that were often worse than no treatment at all. The Roman practice of attempting to induce labor using physical manipulation, herbal preparations, and mechanical interventions often caused complications that were worse than delayed delivery. These induction techniques were performed without understanding of fetal maturity, cervical readiness, or the risks of premature intervention. Roman obstetric education was based on apprenticeship systems that transmitted both useful knowledge and dangerous misconceptions from generation to generation, without any method for distinguishing between effective and harmful practices. Young midwives learned by watching their mentors, absorbing techniques that had been passed down through centuries of trial and error that probably killed as many women as it saved. The Roman approach to managing shoulder dystocia and other delivery complications involved traction techniques that often resulted in permanent injury to both mother and child. These procedures were performed without understanding of proper technique or the biomechanics of birth, leading to injuries that could have been prevented with appropriate knowledge. Roman pharmaceutical preparations for obstetric emergencies included substances that we now know were toxic, carcinogenic, or otherwise harmful to human health. These medicines were administered based on theoretical principles derived from ancient texts rather than empirical observation, creating a system where treatment was often worse than the original problem. The Roman practice of attempting to repair birth injuries using primitive surgical techniques often caused additional trauma and infection that proved fatal. These procedures were performed without proper instruments, anesthesia, or understanding of tissue healing, turning minor injuries into major medical disasters. Roman birthing attendants often performed procedures on multiple patients without washing their hands or changing their clothes, spreading infections with the efficiency of walking biological weapons. The concept of personal hygiene in medical settings was completely unknown, and attendants moved freely between patients carrying contamination that killed women who might otherwise have survived. The Roman approach to managing premature rupture of membranes involved bed rest and prayer, with no understanding of the risks of infection or the need for careful monitoring. Women with this condition often developed infections that proved fatal, while their families watched and waited for divine intervention that never came. Roman treatment of hyperemesis gravidarum and other severe pregnancy complications involved bloodletting, purging, and other interventions that probably worsened the underlying conditions while providing the illusion of medical action. These treatments were based on theoretical principles that had no connection to the actual pathophysiology of the diseases being treated. The Roman practice of attempting to prevent miscarriage using mechanical interventions, herbal preparations, and religious ceremonies often hastened pregnancy loss while subjecting women to unnecessary suffering. These preventive measures were based on superstition rather than medical knowledge, creating false hope while failing to address underlying problems. Roman obstetric instruments were often improvised from household items or tools designed for other purposes, creating a system where medical procedures were performed using equipment that was poorly suited for delicate surgical work. Kitchen knives became scalpels, household hooks became surgical instruments, and the results were predictably disastrous. The Roman understanding of fetal development was based on philosophical theories rather than empirical observation, leading to treatments and interventions that were timed incorrectly and often harmful to both mother and child. The lack of understanding of embryology and fetal physiology meant that Roman physicians were essentially operating blindfolded in situations that required precise knowledge and careful timing. Roman birthing chambers became repositories of accumulated contamination that created environments hostile to human health, where infections flourished and spread among vulnerable patients who had no defense against bacterial invasion. These rooms were cleaned cosmetically rather than medically, leaving behind invisible armies of pathogens that killed with relentless efficiency. The Roman approach to managing postpartum depression and other psychological complications of childbirth involved attributing mental symptoms to divine displeasure or moral failings, rather than recognizing them as medical conditions requiring treatment. Women who suffered from these conditions were often blamed for their symptoms rather than receiving the support and care they needed for recovery. As we witness this catalogue of medical horrors disguised as healthcare, it becomes clear that Roman childbirth was less a medical procedure than a test of endurance, where survival depended more on luck than skill, and where the best medical care available was often more dangerous than no treatment at all. The psychological landscape of Roman childbirth was a battlefield where feminine duty collided with mortal terror, creating mental casualties that no physician could heal and no priest could absolve. Roman women approached pregnancy knowing that each conception might be their last conscious act, each labor potentially their final performance on the stage of existence. Yet they were expected to embrace this biological Russian roulette with the enthusiasm of gladiators entering the arena voluntarily. The Roman matron's psyche was carefully conditioned from childhood to accept reproductive martyrdom as the highest form of feminine virtue, a psychological preparation that was both merciful and cruel. Merciful because it provided a framework for understanding inevitable suffering, cruel because it transformed natural biological processes into moral obligations that could be failed, judged, and found wanting by gods and men alike. Roman women developed elaborate mental defenses against the reality of maternal mortality, constructing belief systems that allowed them to function despite knowing that each pregnancy was essentially a death sentence with a possibility of parole. They told themselves stories about divine protection, family honor, and the nobility of sacrifice, stories that provided comfort right up until the moment when bleeding wouldn't stop and prayers went unanswered. The social isolation experienced by Roman women during pregnancy intensified their psychological vulnerability, as they were separated from normal activities and relationships to protect both their health and the developing child. This isolation was intended to be beneficial, but often became a form of solitary confinement, where anxious minds had unlimited time to contemplate all the ways that childbirth could destroy their lives. Roman religious conditioning taught women to interpret pregnancy complications as divine punishment for moral failings, creating a psychological framework where physical suffering was compounded by spiritual shame. A woman whose labour failed to progress normally faced not only medical danger, but also the crushing weight of believing that her own inadequacies had endangered her child and disappointed the gods. The Roman emphasis on stoic endurance during childbirth created impossible psychological pressures for women who were expected to suffer gracefully while experiencing pain that would break strong men. They were taught that screaming, crying, or expressing fear indicated weak character and insufficient devotion to duty, leaving them to endure agony and silence while their minds shattered under the strain. Roman women who survived difficult deliveries often developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, haunted by memories of pain, helplessness, and terror that no amount of religious ceremony could erase. They carried these psychological wounds through subsequent pregnancies, each new conception triggering flashbacks to previous traumatic experiences that made future labours even more terrifying. The Roman cultural expectation that women should be grateful for the opportunity to risk death in service to family and state created a psychological paradox where victims were required to thank their oppressors. Women who expressed fear or reluctance about pregnancy were treated as ungrateful and unnatural, adding social shame to biological terror in proportions that would challenge the sanity of the strongest minds. Roman wives, caught between their husband's desire for heirs and their own terror of childbirth, often developed complex psychological survival mechanisms that allowed them to function despite living in constant fear of their next pregnancy. They might embrace religious fanaticism, develop obsessive rituals, or retreat into fantasy worlds where divine protection was guaranteed and pain was always temporary. The Roman practice of forcing very young girls into marriage and immediate pregnancy created psychological trauma that modern medicine recognizes as a form of institutionalized abuse. These children, barely past puberty themselves, were expected to embrace adult responsibilities while their minds were still developing, creating mental fractures that often never healed properly. Roman women who experienced multiple pregnancy losses often developed elaborate guilt complexes, believing that their failures to carry children to term indicated divine displeasure with their conduct or character. This internalized blame created psychological prisons where grieving mothers tortured themselves with questions about what they had done wrong and how they might appease angry gods. The Roman social pressure to produce male heirs created additional psychological stress for women who gave birth to daughters, as they faced not only the normal dangers of childbirth, but also the social consequences of failing to fulfill their primary reproductive duty. This pressure often led to depression, anxiety, and self-blame that persisted long after physical recovery from delivery. Roman medical practitioners often dismissed women's psychological symptoms as hysteria or moral weakness, leaving traumatized mothers without support or understanding for mental injuries that were as real and debilitating as physical wounds. The Roman medical system had no concept of psychological trauma, treating emotional suffering as a character flaw rather than a medical condition requiring care. The Roman practice of separating mothers from their children immediately after birth to prevent emotional attachment in case of infant death created psychological confusion for women who were simultaneously encouraged to love their children and warned against loving them too much. This emotional double bind often led to depression, anxiety, and difficulty forming healthy relationships with surviving children. Roman women who developed complications during pregnancy often experienced psychological terror that was intensified by their understanding of how limited and dangerous the available treatments were. They faced medical procedures knowing that intervention was often more dangerous than the original problem, creating mental anguish that compounded physical suffering in ways that defied measurement. The Roman cultural obsession with divination and omens created additional psychological stress for pregnant women, who constantly searched for signs about their fate, while knowing that unfavorable omens could become self-fulfilling prophecies. They lived in mental worlds where every dream, every unusual event, and every random occurrence might predict their doom or salvation. Roman society's treatment of widows and childless women as social failures created powerful psychological incentives for women to risk death in pursuit of successful motherhood, even when their personal inclinations or physical condition suggested that pregnancy was inadvisable. The fear of social ostracism often overwhelmed rational self-preservation instincts. The Roman emphasis on family honor and genetic continuity placed enormous psychological pressure on women to produce healthy children regardless of personal cost, creating mental frameworks where individual survival was less important than reproductive success. This value system encouraged women to ignore their own needs and accept unnecessary risks in pursuit of family goals. Roman women who survived childbirth often experienced survivor's guilt when friends, relatives, or neighbors died in similar circumstances, wondering why they had been spared when others had perished. This psychological burden was intensified by the Roman belief that survival indicated divine favor, implying that those who died had somehow deserved their fate. The Roman practice of blaming women for birth defects, infant deaths, and other reproductive failures created psychological environments where mothers were held responsible for outcomes beyond their control. This blame often led to depression, anxiety, and self-destructive behaviors that persisted long after the immediate crisis had passed. Roman religious teachings about the afterlife provided little comfort for women who died in childbirth, as their fate depended on their moral conduct rather than their reproductive sacrifice. This uncertainty about eternal consequences added spiritual terror to physical fear, creating psychological burdens that made dying even more frightening than it would have been otherwise. The Roman social expectation that women should be honored for their reproductive sacrifice, while simultaneously being blamed for reproductive failures, created psychological contradictions that were impossible to resolve. Women were simultaneously celebrated as life-givers and condemned as death-bringers, depending on outcomes they couldn't control. Roman women who developed mental illness during or after pregnancy were often treated as if they were possessed by evil spirits or cursed by offended gods, leading to exorcism attempts and religious rituals that increased their psychological distress rather than providing healing. The Roman medical system had no effective treatments for mental health conditions, leaving suffering women to endure psychological torture disguised as spiritual intervention. The Roman practice of forcing women to continue pregnancies regardless of medical complications created psychological situations where maternal love conflicted with survival instincts, as women were required to choose between their own lives and their children's welfare. This forced choice often led to mental breakdowns that persisted long after the immediate crisis had resolved. Roman women who experienced sexual trauma during medical examinations or treatments had no recourse for addressing their psychological injuries, as Roman society didn't recognize the concept of medical sexual abuse. These women suffered in silence, adding psychological trauma to physical pain in combinations that often proved more destructive than the original medical conditions. The Roman cultural belief that women's emotions were inherently unstable and dangerous led to medical treatments that focused on controlling female psychology rather than addressing underlying health problems. Women's legitimate concerns about pregnancy risks were dismissed as hysteria, leaving them without support when they most needed understanding and care. Roman society's conflicted attitudes toward female sexuality created psychological confusion for women who were simultaneously expected to be pure and passionate, virtuous and fertile, modest and seductive. These contradictory expectations often led to identity crises that were intensified by the psychological stress of pregnancy and childbirth. The Roman practice of arranged marriage often left women facing pregnancy and childbirth with husbands they barely knew and didn't love, creating psychological isolation during the most vulnerable periods of their lives. This emotional abandonment intensified the terror of childbirth, while eliminating the comfort that might have helped women cope with their fears. Roman women's lack of legal and economic independence meant that their psychological well-being depended entirely on the goodwill of male relatives, who might or might not provide the support needed for mental health recovery after traumatic birth experiences. This powerlessness often led to learned helplessness that persisted long after physical healing was complete. As we observe the systematic destruction of female psychological health in the name of reproductive duty, we begin to understand that Roman childbirth was not just a medical challenge, but a form of institutionalized psychological warfare waged against half the population in the name of civilization and divine will. The moment arrived, as it inevitably did in Roman obstetrics, when all the prayers, medical interventions, and divine bargaining proved insufficient against the simple biological reality that bringing new life into the world required more than good intentions and expensive equipment. Death in Roman childbirth wasn't dramatic or cinematic. It was usually slow, messy, and accompanied by the gradual realization that neither gods nor physicians were particularly interested in preventing it. Roman women facing obstetric death often experienced a peculiar clarity in their final hours, a mental lucidity that cut through years of conditioning about divine protection and medical competence to reveal the fundamental truth that they were dying for the sake of social expectations that would outlast their individual suffering. It was a moment of terrible enlightenment that came too late to change anything but early enough to understand everything. The Roman household response to maternal death during childbirth followed established protocols that prioritized damage control over grief, focusing on saving face rather than mourning loss. Servants were dispatched to summon priests for last rites. Relatives were notified according to strict social hierarchies, and preparations began for funeral arrangements that would emphasize the woman's virtue rather than question the system that had killed her. Roman physicians facing the death of their obstetric patients typically blamed divine displeasure, patient non-compliance, or unavoidable circumstances rather than acknowledging the limitations of their knowledge or the dangers of their interventions. Medical failure was rarely attributed to medical ignorance, preserving professional reputations while leaving grieving families without answers or accountability. The Roman legal system's response to maternal death in childbirth was bureaucratic and unsympathetic, treating these fatalities as natural occurrences rather than preventable tragedies. No investigations were conducted, no negligence was acknowledged, and no reforms were implemented to prevent similar deaths in the future. Women died, records were updated, and life continued without pause for reflection or improvement. Roman religious authorities interpreted maternal death during childbirth as evidence of divine will rather than medical failure, offering comfort to grieving families, while simultaneously absolving the medical and religious systems of responsibility for preventable deaths. The gods, apparently, had mysterious purposes that mere mortals couldn't understand, which was a convenient explanation for outcomes that competent medical care might have prevented. The economic impact of maternal death on Roman families was often devastating, as households lost not only beloved wives and daughters, but also their primary managers of domestic affairs and child-rearing responsibilities. Surviving husbands faced the challenge of replacing irreplaceable women while dealing with their own grief and the practical demands of managing households they had never been trained to run. Roman funeral practices for women who died in childbirth emphasized their reproductive sacrifice, while glossing over the medical and social failures that had contributed to their deaths. Tombstone inscriptions praised their virtue and devotion without mentioning the primitive medical care or dangerous practices that had killed them, creating historical records that obscured rather than illuminated the true causes of maternal mortality. The Roman approach to caring for motherless children reflected the empire's practical mindset about family management, focusing on finding suitable replacements for deceased mothers, rather than addressing the underlying problems that had created so many orphans. Wet nurses, stepmothers, and female relatives assumed responsibility for children whose mothers had died, fulfilling their reproductive duties, perpetuating cycles of risk without questioning the systems that created them. Roman society's response to high maternal mortality rates was acceptance rather than outrage, treating these deaths as inevitable consequences of feminine biology rather than preventable results of inadequate medical knowledge and dangerous practices. This acceptance allowed dangerous traditions to persist across generations, killing women who might have survived with better care or different social expectations. The Roman medical establishment's reaction to persistent maternal mortality was to refine their theories rather than question their fundamental assumptions, creating increasingly elaborate explanations for failures without acknowledging that their basic understanding of human reproduction was fundamentally flawed. They treated symptoms rather than causes, adjusted techniques rather than abandoning dangerous practices, and maintained professional confidence despite outcomes that would shame modern medical practitioners. Roman husbands who lost wives in childbirth often remarried quickly, driven by practical necessity rather than emotional healing. The need for household management, childcare, and continued reproduction meant that grieving was a luxury few men could afford, leading to marriages that replaced dead women without honouring their memory or learning from their sacrifice. The Roman cultural response to maternal death was to glorify suffering rather than prevent it, creating heroic narratives about women who died in reproductive service, while ignoring the medical and social reforms that might have saved their lives. This romanticization of maternal martyrdom discouraged critical examination of deadly practices, while encouraging future generations to accept unnecessary risks. Roman infant mortality following maternal death was catastrophically high, as newborns lost not only their primary food source, but also their most dedicated caregivers. Wet nurses and substitute mothers often lacked the emotional investment needed to provide optimal care, leading to secondary casualties that multiplied the human cost of obstetric failures. The Roman practice of blaming maternal death on divine will or personal failing rather than medical inadequacy prevented the systematic analysis that might have led to improved outcomes for future mothers. Each death was treated as an isolated tragedy rather than part of a pattern that demanded investigation and reform, ensuring that deadly mistakes were repeated indefinitely. Roman medical education continued to emphasize theoretical knowledge over practical experience, ensuring that future physicians would repeat the same errors that had killed their predecessors' patients. The apprenticeship system transmitted both useful knowledge and dangerous misconceptions without distinguishing between them, creating cycles of ignorance that persisted across generations of medical practitioners. The Roman social system's dependence on high birth rates to maintain population levels meant that maternal mortality was treated as an acceptable cost of demographic maintenance rather than a medical emergency requiring urgent attention. Women's lives were weighed against military recruitment needs and economic productivity, with individual survival considered less important than collective reproduction. Roman families who lost multiple women to childbirth complications often developed fatalistic attitudes about feminine mortality that discouraged investment in medical improvement or social reform. The acceptance of death as inevitable made it easier to endure loss, but harder to prevent future tragedies that might have been avoided with better knowledge or different priorities. The Roman Empire's gradual decline coincided with deteriorating medical care for women, as economic pressures and social instability reduced resources available for healthcare, while increasing the risks associated with pregnancy and childbirth. Women died at higher rates during periods of imperial stress, but these deaths were attributed to general hardship rather than specific medical failures. Roman historical records from the later imperial period show increasing maternal mortality rates that paralleled other indicators of social decay, suggesting that women's reproductive health served as a barometer for broader civilization health. As the empire weakened, women died more frequently in childbirth, but cause and effect were never clearly established or addressed. The Roman legacy in obstetrics was a mixture of useful innovations and persistent deadly practices that continued to kill women long after the empire itself had fallen. Medieval and Renaissance medical practitioners inherited Roman techniques without understanding their limitations, perpetuating cycles of maternal mortality that might have been broken with better critical analysis. Roman civilization's failure to address maternal mortality reflected broader problems with their approach to medical knowledge, social reform, and individual rights that ultimately contributed to the empire's decline. A society that couldn't protect half its population during their most vulnerable moments was poorly equipped to address other challenges that required systematic analysis and effective intervention. The irony of Roman obstetrics was that an empire capable of remarkable engineering and administrative achievements proved incapable of preventing unnecessary deaths during childbirth, suggesting that technical competence and social wisdom don't necessarily develop together. They could build aqueducts that lasted millennia, but couldn't keep women alive during labor. A disconnect that reveals fundamental flaws in their priorities and understanding. Roman women who died in childbirth were quickly forgotten by historical records that focused on military campaigns and political developments rather than domestic tragedies that shaped family life and demographic patterns. Their deaths were treated as private losses rather than public health failures, ensuring that lessons learned from their suffering were never systematically collected or applied. The Roman approach to maternal death was reactive rather than preventive, focusing on managing grief and maintaining social stability rather than addressing the medical and social causes of preventable mortality. This approach ensured that deadly patterns persisted across generations without systematic intervention or improvement. As Roman civilization faded into history, the women who had died in childbirth left behind a legacy of biological sacrifice that had sustained the empire's population while receiving little recognition or protection from the society they had served. Their deaths were recorded as statistics rather than tragedies, remembered as demographic data rather than human losses that might have been prevented with better knowledge and different priorities. And so we reach the end of our journey through the blood-soaked chambers and incense-clouded rooms, where Roman women wagered their lives against the promise of continuing their family lines, often losing bets they never wanted to make in the first place. As you settle deeper into your blankets tonight, perhaps grateful for the mundane miracle of modern obstetrics, consider the strange arithmetic of empire that could engineer bridges spanning impossible gorges while remaining helpless before the basic challenge of preventing women from bleeding to death during what should have been the most natural process in the world. The Roman approach to childbirth reveals something profound about civilizational priorities, showing us a society that could calculate eclipse paths with stunning accuracy, while treating maternal mortality as an acceptable cost of maintaining demographic stability. They built monuments that still inspire awe 2 millennia later, yet they couldn't figure out that washing hands before delivering babies might be worth trying, which tells us everything we need to know about how technical brilliance and human wisdom don't necessarily evolve together. Roman women, those largely nameless figures who appear in historical records mainly as wives, mothers, and cautionary tales, carried the biological burden of empire while receiving little credit for their sacrifice and even less protection from the medical establishment that was supposed to serve them. They died in impressive numbers for the sake of producing future citizens who would build roads, fight wars, and write histories that rarely mentioned the maternal mortality rates that had made their existence possible in the first place. The legacy of Roman obstetrics lingered long after the last legions had marched home, influencing medieval and Renaissance medical practices that continued to kill women with techniques that had been inadequate when they were first developed in ancient times. It's a sobering reminder that medical knowledge can regress as well as progress, and that surviving ancient texts aren't necessarily reliable guides to effective healthcare, despite their impressive theoretical frameworks and confident tone. Perhaps the most remarkable thing about Roman childbirth wasn't the primitive medical techniques or the religious superstitions, but the sheer determination of women who continue to risk death for the sake of continuing life, generation after generation, despite knowing exactly how dangerous their reproductive duties had become. They faced odds that would discourage modern gamblers while maintaining enough optimism to keep trying, which suggests reserves of courage that put gladiatorial bravery to shame. The Roman Empire fell eventually, brought down by barbarian invasions, economic collapse, political corruption, and military overextension. But it might have lasted longer if they had invested as much energy in protecting women during childbirth as they spent on protecting borders against foreign armies. A civilization that loses half its mothers to preventable deaths is essentially committing demographic suicide in slow motion, no matter how impressive its monuments or how efficient its bureaucracy. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, in a world where childbirth mortality has dropped to levels that would seem miraculous to ancient Romans, remember that this progress came not from divine intervention or mysterious historical forces, but from the gradual accumulation of medical knowledge by people who are willing to question traditional practices and test new approaches rather than simply repeating the mistakes of their predecessors. The Roman story reminds us that survival isn't guaranteed by technological advancement alone, but requires wisdom, compassion, and the courage to acknowledge when cherished traditions are actually killing people. Sweet dreams, and may your rest be peaceful and mercifully free of the sounds of ancient birthing chambers, where prayers mixed with screams in proportions that would have made the gods themselves reach for stronger wine. Roman civilization gave us roads, laws, literature, and architectural techniques that still influence modern construction, but they couldn't solve the basic problem of keeping women alive during childbirth, which proves that even the most impressive civilizations have blind spots that can prove fatal to those who depend on them most. Sleep well, knowing that sometimes the most boring aspects of modern life, like basic hygiene and effective pain relief, represent victories over suffering that our ancestors could barely imagine, much less achieve.